In the winter of 1895, 17 congregants of St. Bartholomew's Church simply vanished. Not all at once. That would have been too obvious, too alarming. Instead, they disappeared in pairs, sometimes alone, always with the same explanation: divine calling, a higher purpose, the Lord's work elsewhere. By spring, 43 souls had quietly departed from the remote New Hampshire valley that had been their home for generations. Their pastor, Father Alaric Thorne, delivered the news with serene certainty. Sister Margaret had received a vision to minister among the poor in Boston. The Whitmore family felt called to spread the gospel in the Western Territories. Young Rebecca Mills had dedicated her life to serving orphans in distant missions. The remaining congregation nodded with vacant smiles, their eyes reflecting an unsettling emptiness that visitors would later describe as the gaze of sleepwalkers. No one questioned why these spiritual awakenings occurred with such remarkable frequency. No one asked why those called to higher service never sent word of their new lives. No one wondered why the ancient stone church seemed to grow more oppressive with each departure, its shadows deeper, its silence more profound. But someone should have asked, because beneath St. Bartholomew's Church, in chambers that predated its consecrated walls by centuries, a horror was unfolding that would challenge every notion of faith, sacrifice, and the pursuit of eternal life. Before we descend into this buried chapter of American darkness, this channel isn't for everyone, only for the bravest souls who dare to uncover the truths that powerful people tried to erase forever. If you have the courage to witness what really happened in that isolated valley, hit that subscribe button, give this video a like, and let us know in the comments what state you're watching from. Are you brave enough to join our community of true mystery seekers? Let's find out together. Tonight we reveal the macabre mystery of St. Bartholomew's Church, where the line between salvation and damnation was not merely crossed, it was obliterated entirely. The year 1895 found America balanced precariously between centuries, clinging to rural traditions while industrial progress thundered through its cities. In the remote valleys of New Hampshire, however, time moved differently. Here, among ancient granite peaks and forests that had witnessed Native American rituals for millennia, some communities existed as islands of the past, untouched by the rapid changes transforming the nation. The valley that sheltered St. Bartholomew's Church was one such place, a pocket of isolation so complete that winter snows could cut it off from the outside world for months at a time. The nearest town, Millfield, lay 27 miles away along treacherous mountain roads that became impassable during the harsh New England winters. This geographical isolation had shaped the character of the community for over 2 centuries, fostering a self-reliance that bordered on insularity and a religious devotion that approached fanaticism. St. Bartholomew's Church dominated the valley like a medieval fortress transported through time. Built in 1743 on foundations that local historians claimed were far older, possibly dating to forgotten colonial settlements or even pre-Columbian structures, the building possessed an austere magnificence that commanded both reverence and unease. Its walls, constructed from massive granite blocks quarried from the surrounding mountains, rose 3 stories above the valley floor, their gray surfaces darkened by decades of weather and shadow. The architecture defied easy categorization. While ostensibly Anglican in design, the church incorporated elements that seemed almost pagan in origin. Carved stone faces that leered from the corners of the building, symbols etched into the foundation stones that bore no resemblance to Christian iconography, and a bell tower that rose like an accusatory finger toward heaven. The windows, unusually small and positioned high on the walls, filtered the interior light into a perpetual twilight that made even noon services feel like evening vigils. Most unsettling of all was the church's relationship to the landscape itself. Rather than sitting harmoniously within the natural contours of the valley, St. Bartholomew's seemed to impose itself upon the earth with an almost violent assertion of dominance. The building cast shadows that appeared too long for the sun's position, and visitors often remarked on an oppressive weight in the air surrounding the structure, as if the very atmosphere had grown thick with accumulated prayers and unspoken secrets. The congregation that gathered within these ancient walls reflected the isolated character of their valley home, 73 families formed the core of the community, their bloodlines intertwined through generations of intermarriage necessitated by geographic isolation. They were a people shaped by harsh winters and harder faith, their devotion absolute and unquestioning. Outsiders who occasionally stumbled upon their services described an intensity of worship that bordered on the ecstatic, with prayers delivered in voices that seemed to echo from the depths of their souls. This was the world that had nurtured Father Thorne's particular vision of Christianity, a faith stripped of modern compromise, purified by isolation, and focused on the fundamental truth that salvation required sacrifice. In such fertile ground, his doctrine of spiritual purification through devotion found eager acceptance among souls hungry for meaning in their remote existence. The valley itself seemed to approve. Ancient evergreens pressed close to the church grounds, their branches creating a natural cathedral that amplified the building's imposing presence. Local folklore spoke of the land's sacred nature, of Native American ceremonies conducted in clearings now overgrown with moss and shadow. Some claimed the very stones of the church's foundation hummed with an energy that predated Christian blessing, a power that the faithful attributed to divine providence, but that others found deeply unsettling. The man who stood at St. Bartholomew's pulpit each Sunday morning possessed a presence that could transform the most mundane scripture into divine commandment. Father Alaric Thorne had arrived in the valley during the bitter winter of 1889, emerging from a blizzard like a figure from biblical prophecy, tall and lean with prematurely silver hair that caught the church's dim light like spun moonbeams. He carried himself with the bearing of Old Testament authority. His eyes were perhaps his most arresting feature, pale gray orbs that seemed to see not just into congregant souls but through them entirely. When Father Thorne fixed his gaze upon someone during his sermons, they reported feeling as though every sin, every doubt, every secret shame was laid bare before divine judgment. Children would later describe nightmares of those eyes following them through the darkness, while adults found themselves confessing transgressions they had never intended to reveal. Thorne's voice possessed an almost hypnotic quality, capable of rising from whispered intimacy to thunderous proclamation without losing its essential musicality. His sermons were masterpieces of theological precision, drawing from obscure texts and ancient commentaries that demonstrated scholarship far beyond what might be expected in such a remote location. He spoke of sacrifice with the fervor of a man who had witnessed its transformative power firsthand, of purification through suffering as the only path to true spiritual elevation. Most unsettling was his apparent knowledge of each congregant's private struggles and secret fears. Without explanation, he would address their hidden doubts from the pulpit, offer solutions to problems they had never spoken aloud, and provide comfort for griefs they had shared with no one. This uncanny insight earned him a devotion that bordered on worship itself as his flock came to believe. Their pastor possessed divine revelation unavailable to ordinary mortals. Thorne's sermons increasingly focused on the concept of spiritual transference, the idea that pure souls could serve as vessels for divine grace, allowing their accumulated virtue to be channeled toward higher purposes. He spoke of ancient practices of early Christian martyrs who had achieved such perfect communion with the divine that their very essence became a conduit for God's power. These themes, woven through months of careful theological preparation, laid the groundwork for what would follow. Standing always at Father Thorne's right hand was Deacon Elias Croft, a man whose scholarly demeanor masked depths of calculation that would have chilled anyone capable of recognizing them. Where Thorne commanded through charismatic authority, Croft influenced through meticulous attention to detail and an encyclopedic knowledge of church doctrine that made him indispensable to both pastor and congregation. Croft had appeared in the valley shortly after Thorne's arrival, claiming to be a former seminary professor whose health required the restorative air of mountain isolation. His credentials seemed impeccable: letters of recommendation from prestigious theological institutions, testimonials from prominent church officials, and a personal library of rare religious texts that impressed even visiting scholars. What the congregation didn't know was that these documents, like the man himself, were elaborate fabrications designed to establish credibility for work that defied all moral boundaries. The deacon maintained the church's extensive archives with an obsessiveness that surpassed mere professional dedication. Every baptism, marriage, and funeral was recorded with scientific precision. Every confession was noted in coded entries that only he and Father Thorne could decipher. Most significantly, Croft maintained detailed records of each congregant's spiritual condition, their susceptibility to divine calling, and their potential value for higher service. His living quarters, located in the church's bell tower, contained collections that would have horrified anyone aware of their true nature. Ancient texts on subjects far removed from conventional theology lined his shelves. Treatises on consciousness, anatomical studies, and philosophical explorations of the soul's relationship to physical form. His correspondence with European scholars revealed a network of like-minded individuals pursuing knowledge that legitimate institutions would never sanction. Croft's unnerving composure never wavered, regardless of circumstances. He faced the disappearance of congregants with the same measured calm he brought to organizing church fundraisers. His explanations for unusual events were always logical, always delivered with scholarly authority that discouraged further questioning. Behind his wire-rimmed spectacles, his pale blue eyes reflected an intelligence that seemed to catalog human behavior with scientific detachment. The third member of this unholy trinity presented the most deceptive facade of all. Sister Agnes moved through the valley community like a medieval saint made flesh, her presence bringing comfort to the sick and solace to the grieving. She appeared to be in her 40s, though her serene features made precise aging impossible. With graying brown hair always modestly covered and hands that seemed blessed with healing touch. Agnes had arrived claiming to be a nursing sister from a disbanded convent in Quebec, seeking to continue her calling in a community that would appreciate her dedication to Christian service. Her knowledge of herbal remedies was extensive. Her ability to ease suffering seemed almost miraculous, and her gentle manner made her the natural confidant for women struggling with the isolation and hardships of valley life. What made Sister Agnes particularly valuable to Thorne and Croft's enterprise was her unique access to the community's most vulnerable members. As the settlement's unofficial physician, she was called to attend births, deaths, and everything in between. Her herbal preparations could ease pain or induce states of consciousness that made patients remarkably susceptible to suggestion. Her quiet presence in sick rooms allowed her to observe family dynamics, assess individual psychological profiles, and identify those whose disappearance would cause minimal disruption to community stability. Agnes possessed an almost supernatural ability to remain unnoticed when observation was required. She could enter a room, complete her work, and depart without leaving any clear memory of her presence beyond the results of her intervention. This invisible quality made her the perfect advanced scout for identifying suitable candidates for the church's special ministry. Her herbal garden, cultivated in the secluded area behind the church, contained plants that extended far beyond conventional medicinal applications. Careful observation would have revealed species with psychoactive properties, compounds that could induce compliance or confusion, and preparations that could simulate various medical conditions when circumstances required more dramatic explanations for a congregant's spiritual transformation. Together, these three formed a triumvirate whose individual talents complemented each other with terrifying efficiency. Thorne provided the theological framework and charismatic authority necessary to maintain congregational compliance. Croft supplied the scholarly legitimacy and meticulous documentation that would preserve their work for posterity. Agnes offered direct access to potential subjects and the medical knowledge required to implement their vision of spiritual purification. Their collaboration represented more than mere criminal conspiracy. It was a systematic approach to human experimentation disguised as religious devotion, carried out in a location where geographic isolation and absolute community trust made detection virtually impossible. The ancient stones of St. Bartholomew's Church had witnessed many rituals over the centuries, but none more calculated or more horrific than those conducted by the Trinity of Terror that had claimed its pulpit. The Macabre Mystery of St. Bartholomew's Church, Sections 4 to 6. Section 4, The Pattern of Disappearances. The first to vanish was Rebecca Mills, a spirited young woman of 19, whose crime was asking too many questions during Father Thorne's increasingly intense sermons. On a gray November morning in 1894, she simply wasn't at breakfast with her family. Her bed had been slept in, her clothes remained in their chest, but Rebecca herself had evaporated like morning mist. Father Thorne delivered the explanation with his characteristic serene authority during that Sunday service. Rebecca had experienced a profound spiritual awakening during her midnight prayers, he announced. The Lord had called her to serve among the poor children of Boston's slums, a mission so urgent that she had departed immediately to answer divine summons. The congregation murmured their approval, though some noticed that Rebecca's mother seemed unusually composed for a woman whose daughter had left without saying goodbye. 2 weeks later, it was the Whitmore family, husband, wife, and their twin daughters aged 16. Again, the explanation came from the pulpit with ecclesiastical certainty. A divine vision had revealed their calling to establish a mission in the Dakota Territories, where their combined talents would serve God's greater purpose. Their farmstead was quietly absorbed by neighboring families, their belongings distributed among the congregation as gifts from departed souls who no longer required earthly possessions. By Christmas of 1894, 8 more congregants had received similar callings. Each departure followed the same pattern: sudden spiritual awakening, immediate departure without farewells, and Father Thorne's confident explanation of their new divine purpose. What made these vanishings particularly unsettling was the reaction of the remaining congregation, or rather their complete lack of reaction. Where normal communities might have questioned such frequent departures, the faithful of St. Bartholomew's accepted each explanation with nodding compliance. Family members showed no grief at sudden separations. Neighbors expressed no surprise at friends disappearing without notice. The congregation seemed to exist in a collective trance, their responses muted and their questioning instincts thoroughly suppressed. This unnatural acceptance might have continued indefinitely if not for the arrival of Reverend Joshua Blackwood in February 1895. An itinerant Methodist preacher traveling between remote settlements, Blackwood had sought shelter at St. Bartholomew's during a particularly savage blizzard. What he observed during his 3-day stay would haunt him for the remainder of his life. Blackwood immediately noticed the strange uniformity among the congregation. Their synchronized movements during worship, their identical expressions of vacant contentment, and their unsettling habit of speaking in phrases that seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous. When he inquired about the community's stability, expecting the usual complaints about harsh winters and economic hardship, he was told repeatedly how blessed they were to have so many members called to higher service. The mathematics alone should have raised alarms. In the 18 months since Father Thorne's arrival, 43 people had supposedly left to pursue religious callings elsewhere. For a community of only 73 families, this represented an exodus of biblical proportions. Yet those who remained spoke of these departures as evidence of their spiritual elevation rather than cause for concern. Most disturbing was Blackwood's attempt to engage individual congregants in private conversation. Without exception, they deflected personal questions with religious platitudes delivered in the same measured cadence Father Thorne used during sermons. They showed no individual personality, no personal opinions, no emotional responses that seemed genuinely their own. It was as if the entire congregation had been replaced by carefully programmed automatons designed to simulate religious devotion. During his final evening at the church, Blackwood witnessed something that confirmed his growing suspicions. From his guest quarters in the church's upper level, he observed a group of congregants moving through the building in the pre-dawn darkness. They walked with the mechanical precision of sleepwalkers, carrying bundles that seemed too heavy for ordinary church supplies. Most chilling of all, they descended into areas of the building that he had been told were sealed storage areas, emerging hours later empty-handed and moving with the same eerie synchronization. When Blackwood attempted to follow their path the next morning, he found the basement access blocked by heavy wooden doors secured with locks that seemed far more substantial than would be necessary for simple storage. His questions about the basement areas were met with polite deflection from Deacon Croft, who explained that the lower levels contained only old records and seasonal supplies that required careful climate control to prevent deterioration. The Reverend's departure from St. Bartholomew's was hastened by an encounter that left him convinced he had witnessed something fundamentally wrong. On his final morning, he encountered Sister Agnes in the church garden, tending to plants that he recognized as having properties far beyond simple medicinal herbs. When he commented on her unusual botanical knowledge, her response chilled him to the bone. "The Lord provides many paths to enlightenment, Reverend Blackwood," she had said with her characteristic gentle smile. "Some souls require more intensive guidance to achieve the spiritual clarity necessary for higher service. We simply provide the tools that divine providence has placed in our hands." The implications of her words, combined with everything else he had observed, sent Blackwood fleeing the valley as soon as the roads became passable. His subsequent attempts to interest church authorities in investigating St. Bartholomew's were politely dismissed. The isolated community had an established reputation for religious devotion, and Thorne's credentials appeared impeccable to casual examination. But Blackwood's questions had been noted by those he sought to expose. Within a month of his departure, the frequency of divine callings increased dramatically. It seemed Father Thorne had decided that the community required more intensive spiritual purification to maintain the purity of their collective faith. Section 5. Descent into Horror. The Discovery. The truth beneath St. Bartholomew's Church lay buried in chambers that predated both the building above and the European settlement of New Hampshire itself. What Father Thorne and his accomplices had discovered during their first winter in the valley was a network of natural caverns that had been modified by human hands centuries, perhaps millennia, before their arrival. The original builders, whether they were forgotten colonial settlers, earlier Native American inhabitants, or something else entirely, had carved these underground spaces with a sophistication that defied conventional historical understanding. The chambers extended deep into the mountain bedrock, connected by passages that followed the natural contours of underground water sources in geological formations. Most remarkably, the construction showed evidence of precise acoustic engineering, with curved walls and strategic openings that could amplify sound in some areas while completely muffling it in others. Thorne had recognized immediately that these ancient chambers represented an opportunity that divine providence had placed in his path. While the original builder's purposes remained mysterious, the spaces were perfectly suited for the work he intended to conduct. The natural sound dampening meant that activities in the lower chambers would be completely inaudible from the church above. The multiple levels and complex layout provided space for different phases of his experimental procedures. Most importantly, the chamber's hidden nature meant that his work could continue undetected for as long as necessary. The modification of these ancient spaces had taken months of careful planning and construction. Using congregants who believed they were helping to expand the church's storage capabilities, Thorne supervised the installation of specialized equipment that transformed the caverns into something that would have challenged the imagination of medieval inquisitors. The main chamber, nearly 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, became the center of operations, a space that combined the appearance of a chapel with the functionality of a surgical theater. Stone altars that had served unknown purposes for the original builders were converted into examination tables equipped with restraints that could immobilize subjects completely while maintaining access to any part of their anatomy. The natural acoustic properties were enhanced with carefully positioned sound baffles that could contain even the most desperate screaming within the chamber walls. Ventilation systems were installed to manage both air quality and the disposal of various byproducts from the procedures conducted below. Perhaps most elaborate was the preservation facility that occupied the deepest level of the chamber complex. Here, Thorne and his associates maintained their collection of subjects in various states of preparation and study. The natural cool temperature of the deep chambers, combined with chemical preservation techniques derived from ancient Egyptian practices and modern medical understanding, allowed them to maintain specimens for extended periods of observation and experimentation. The rituals of transference that Father Thorne had developed were his masterpiece of twisted theology combined with systematic human experimentation. Drawing from obscure medieval texts, alchemical traditions, and his own perverted understanding of consciousness, he had created procedures that he genuinely believed could extract and transfer the spiritual essence of one person to another. The theological foundation for these rituals was elaborate and internally consistent, drawing from legitimate religious sources twisted to support horrific conclusions. Thorne taught that the human soul was composed of multiple layers, some of which could be separated from the physical body through precise intervention. The pure spiritual essence of devoted believers, he claimed, could be concentrated and transferred to specially prepared vessels, either other humans or carefully consecrated objects, where it would provide enhanced divine connection and spiritual power. The actual procedures bore no resemblance to any legitimate religious ritual. Subjects were first prepared through weeks of psychological conditioning designed to break down their resistance and enhance their spiritual receptivity. Sister Agnes's herbal preparations played a crucial role in this phase, inducing altered states of consciousness that made subjects more susceptible to the theological programming they received during extended sessions in the chambers below. The physical aspects of the transference ritual were conducted with clinical precision that would have impressed contemporary medical researchers. Deacon Croft had developed techniques for accessing specific areas of the brain through carefully placed openings in the skull, using instruments that allowed them to manipulate neural tissue while monitoring the subject's responses. Their goal was not simply to cause brain damage, but to achieve specific alterations in consciousness and personality that would facilitate what they believed to be spiritual extraction. Most horrifying of all was the preservation component of their work. Subjects who survived the initial procedures were maintained in the underground chambers for extended observation and further experimentation. Those who died during the process were preserved using techniques that maintained their bodies in states that suggested peaceful rest rather than violent death. These preserved subjects were arranged in elaborate tableaux throughout the chamber complex, positioned as if participating in eternal prayer services conducted in the darkness below the church. The macabre congregation that accumulated in these hidden chambers represented Thorne's vision of spiritual perfection, souls who had achieved complete purification through his experimental procedures, their earthly forms preserved as monuments to the transformative power of divine science. Visitors to these chambers, had any been permitted, would have encountered dozens of figures arranged in postures of worship, their faces bearing expressions of serene acceptance that masked the horror of their final experiences. Section 6. The Evidence Unveiled. The documentation that would eventually expose the full scope of Father Thorne's enterprise was more extensive and systematic than any legitimate medical research being conducted in America during the 1890s. Hidden throughout the church and the chamber complex below were thousands of pages of meticulous records that revealed the true nature of the work being conducted at St. Bartholomew's. Thorne's personal journals, discovered in a hidden compartment behind the church altar, provided the theological and philosophical framework for his experiments. Written in a combination of English, Latin, and coded symbols of his own devising, these documents revealed a man who genuinely believed he was advancing human understanding of the divine through scientific methodology. His entries traced his intellectual development from orthodox religious scholar to systematic experimenter in human consciousness, documenting his growing conviction that traditional limitations on religious research were preventing crucial advances in spiritual knowledge. The journals revealed that Thorne's work was based on correspondence with a network of European researchers who shared his conviction that consciousness could be studied and manipulated through physical intervention. Letters from universities in Vienna, Edinburgh, and Prague discussed theoretical frameworks for understanding the relationship between brain function and spiritual experience. These correspondents, working within the constraints of civilized academic institutions, could only speculate about procedures that Thorne was implementing with complete freedom in his isolated laboratory. Deacon Croft's contribution to the documentation was even more systematic and disturbing. His records included detailed anatomical drawings showing the precise locations of surgical interventions, measurements correlating skull dimensions with personality traits, and extensive observations linking specific brain modifications to predictable changes in behavior and consciousness. These documents revealed a level of understanding about neurological function that wouldn't be officially recognized by mainstream medicine for decades. Most chilling were Croft's patient files, which tracked each subject from initial evaluation through final disposition. These records documented the complete process. Psychological profiling to identify subjects whose disappearance would cause minimal community disruption, preparation procedures involving systematic conditioning and chemical treatment, detailed surgical notes describing specific interventions performed, and post-operative observations tracking changes in consciousness and behavior. The files revealed that the experiments conducted at St. Bartholomew's were far more sophisticated than random violence or primitive surgery. Each procedure was designed to test specific hypotheses about consciousness, memory, and personality. Some subjects underwent interventions intended to eliminate specific memories while preserving general cognitive function. Others received modifications designed to enhance suggestibility and compliance. A few were subjected to procedures that attempted to implant false memories or artificial personality traits. Sister Agnes's contribution to the documentation focused on the chemical and botanical aspects of their work. Her detailed notes describe the cultivation and preparation of various psychoactive compounds, their effects on human consciousness at different dosages, and their integration with the surgical procedures conducted by her colleagues. Her herbal preparations were not merely sedatives or painkillers, but sophisticated psychochemical tools designed to facilitate specific types of consciousness alteration. Perhaps most disturbing were the preservation records that documented the final disposition of subjects who died during experimentation. These clinical descriptions detailed the techniques used to maintain bodies in lifelike states, the arrangement of preserved subjects in the underground chambers, and the ongoing observations conducted on these macabre displays. The records revealed that some preservation procedures were conducted on subjects who were still alive, but had been rendered unconscious by the experimental procedures, effectively creating a collection of living statues maintained in permanent catatonic states. The correspondence files revealed the international scope of Thorne's network and the commercial aspects of his research. Universities and private researchers throughout Europe were purchasing detailed documentation of procedures they couldn't conduct themselves, paying substantial sums for anatomical specimens and case studies that advanced their theoretical understanding of consciousness and behavior modification. The isolated location of St. Bartholomew's made it an ideal laboratory for research that legitimate institutions could never officially sanction. Most damning of all was the evidence of systematic planning that extended far beyond the immediate experiments. The documentation revealed that Thorne and his associates had been preparing for expansion of their operations, developing techniques for establishing similar facilities in other isolated locations, and training additional researchers in their methodology. Their ultimate goal was the creation of a network of research sites that could advance human understanding of consciousness and spiritual experience through unrestricted experimentation on human subjects. The financial records showed that their work was generating substantial income through multiple sources: fees paid by families for the apparent reformation of troublesome relatives, payments from European institutions for research data and specimens, and investments in various commercial enterprises that provided both funding and cover for their activities. They had accumulated wealth sufficient to support their research indefinitely while maintaining the facade of respectable religious operation. The evidence painted a picture of systematic human experimentation disguised as religious devotion, conducted by individuals who combined genuine scientific curiosity with complete moral bankruptcy. Their work represented a horrific convergence of medical knowledge, theological authority, and geographic isolation that created optimal conditions for crimes that challenged every conception of civilized behavior. The exposure of St. Bartholomew's unholy trinity came not through official investigation or courageous whistleblowing, but through an accident that even Father Thorne's meticulous planning could not have anticipated. On March 15, 1896, a late winter thaw combined with unusually heavy rains caused catastrophic flooding throughout the valley. The ancient drainage systems that had served the underground chambers for centuries were overwhelmed, forcing contaminated water up through hidden outlets and into the church basement. Young Timothy Morrison, the deacon's 16-year-old son from the nearby settlement of Pine Ridge, had been delivering supplies to the church when the flooding began. Seeking shelter from the torrential rain, he entered through the sacristy door and immediately noticed the overwhelming stench of decay mixed with chemical preservatives rising from the basement levels. Following the source of the odor, Timothy discovered that the flooding had forced open several concealed passages that normally remained hidden behind false walls. What Timothy witnessed in those flooded chambers destroyed his faith in humanity and haunted him for the rest of his life. Bodies in various states of preservation bobbed in the rising water like grotesque mannequins, their faces bearing expressions of final agony despite the chemical treatments that had maintained their physical forms. Surgical instruments gleamed in the dim light filtering through basement windows, while waterlogged documents floated among the horror, their clinical descriptions of human experimentation rendered even more obscene by their matter-of-fact tone. The boys' screams brought immediate response from Father Thorne and Deacon Croft, who realized instantly that their carefully maintained secrecy had been shattered. Their first instinct was to silence the witness permanently, but Timothy's father was a prominent merchant whose disappearance would trigger immediate investigation from outside authorities. Instead, they attempted to convince the traumatized teenager that he had suffered hallucinations brought on by the storm's atmospheric pressure and the shocking discovery of historical remains from some forgotten tragedy. But Timothy Morrison possessed both intelligence and moral courage that made him immune to their psychological manipulation. Despite threats that alternated between promises of damnation and hints of physical violence, he refused to accept their explanations or agree to remain silent about what he had witnessed. When the floodwaters receded enough to allow travel, Timothy fled the valley and rode directly to the county sheriff's office in Lebanon, New Hampshire. Sheriff Abraham Whitfield initially greeted Timothy's account with the same skepticism that had met previous allegations against isolated religious communities. However, the boy's detailed descriptions of the underground chambers, combined with his obvious psychological trauma and his family's reputation for honesty, convinced the sheriff that some form of investigation was warranted. More importantly, Timothy had managed to retrieve several waterlogged documents during his escape that provided concrete evidence of the horrors he described. The sheriff's posse that approached St. Bartholomew's Church on March the 22nd, 1896, consisted of 12 armed men prepared for significant resistance. What they found instead was an eerily quiet building that seemed to echo with the memory of vanished voices. Father Thorne, Deacon Croft, and Sister Agnes had disappeared during the night, taking with them whatever portable evidence they could carry and leaving behind only the infrastructure of their horrific enterprise. The investigation that followed revealed the full scope of the atrocities conducted beneath the church. The flooded chambers yielded 47 bodies in various states of preservation, each bearing evidence of systematic surgical experimentation. The documentation left behind filled 7 crates and required months of analysis by medical experts who struggled to comprehend the sophisticated nature of the procedures described. Federal marshals were called in when the investigation revealed the international scope of the operation and the involvement of European research institutions. The scandal threatened to expose prominent universities and medical schools that had unknowingly incorporated data obtained through systematic human experimentation into their official curricula. The implications were so damaging to public confidence in medical science that authorities faced enormous pressure to limit the investigation's scope and suppress its most disturbing findings. The cover-up that followed was as systematic as the crimes themselves. Powerful families whose relatives had been victims of the experiments demanded silence to protect their reputations from the scandal of association with such horrors. Medical institutions that had purchased research data destroyed their records and denied any knowledge of the source of their information. Government officials classified most of the evidence and sealed it in archives that wouldn't be opened for decades. The official report, released 6 months after the discovery, described the incident as a case of 3 mentally disturbed individuals who had operated a fraudulent medical facility while exploiting the isolation and religious devotion of their community. The systematic nature of the experimentation, the international network of collaborators, and the sophisticated documentation were all minimized or omitted entirely from public accounts. St. Agnes, Bartholomew's Church itself was ordered demolished, but local residents took matters into their own hands before official crews could arrive. On a cold October night in 1896, the ancient building was consumed by flames that could be seen for miles across the valley. Some claimed the fire burned with unnatural colors, and that the smoke carried sounds that resembled human screaming. The underground chambers were sealed with concrete and boulders, creating a tomb that local authorities hoped would bury the truth as effectively as it buried the evidence. The families who had lost relatives to Father Thorne's experiments faced an agonizing choice between justice and social survival. Public acknowledgement of their connection to such horrific crimes would destroy their standing in communities where reputation was essential for economic and social survival. Most chose silence, preferring to live with private grief rather than public shame. The few who demanded official recognition of their losses were quietly discouraged through various forms of pressure and compensation. The valley that once echoed with hymns and prayers fell into a silence so profound it seemed to absorb sound itself. Visitors to the area in subsequent years reported an oppressive atmosphere that made even casual conversation feel like sacrilege. The ruins of St. Bartholomew's Church, reduced to a foundation of blackened stones, became a place that local residents avoided instinctively, as if the ground itself retained memory of the horrors it had witnessed. Father Alaric Thorne, Deacon Elias Croft, and Sister Agnes vanished as completely as their victims had, leaving behind only questions that challenge our understanding of human nature and scientific progress. Unconfirmed reports placed them in various locations throughout North America and Europe over the following decades, always associated with isolated religious communities that experienced unusual patterns of spiritual awakening and behavioral transformation. The most credible sighting came from a remote mission in the Canadian wilderness in 1902, where three religious workers, matching their descriptions, had established a treatment facility for Indigenous women suffering from what they termed spiritual corruption. When authorities investigated following reports of unusual disappearances, they found another abandoned facility and evidence of procedures remarkably similar to those documented at St. Bartholomew's. The trail went cold in the vast wilderness, leaving investigators to wonder whether the three had simply perfected their ability to exploit isolated communities or had finally faced justice in the unforgiving landscape they sought to use as cover. Perhaps most disturbing is the knowledge that their research contributed to legitimate advances in understanding consciousness and brain function. The data they generated through systematic human experimentation found its way into medical textbooks and research papers throughout Europe and America, influencing techniques and theories that shaped the development of modern neuroscience and psychology. The ethical foundations of medical progress were forever tainted by the realization that some of humanity's most important discoveries had roots in systematic atrocity. The case of St. Bartholomew's Church forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about the relationship between knowledge and morality, between scientific progress and human dignity. How many other advances in human understanding have been built on foundations of systematic suffering? How easily can noble intentions be corrupted by unchecked authority and isolated power? What safeguards exist to prevent similar horrors from occurring in our own time? The twisted pursuit of immortality and divine knowledge that drove Father Thorne's experiments reveals the dangerous potential of combining scientific methodology with absolute moral flexibility. His genuine belief that he was advancing human understanding of consciousness and spirituality demonstrates how easily intellectual curiosity can become detached from basic human empathy. The systematic nature of his crimes suggests that education and intelligence, divorced from ethical constraints, may actually enhance rather than prevent the commission of unthinkable atrocities. The silence that followed the exposure of these crimes reminds us that society's willingness to confront uncomfortable truths is often limited by its investment in maintaining comfortable illusions. The families, institutions, and government officials who chose secrecy over justice ensured that the victims' suffering would be forgotten and that the lessons of their tragedy would be lost to history. The eerie silence that still hangs over that remote New Hampshire valley serves as a monument to the dangers of unquestioning faith and unchecked authority. The stones that once formed St. Bartholomew's Church have long since been scattered by weather and time, but the questions raised by what occurred there remain as relevant today as they were in 1896. What drives human beings to commit such systematic atrocities in the name of higher purpose? How thin is the veneer of civilization that separates rational inquiry from systematic cruelty? Can the pursuit of knowledge ever justify the sacrifice of human dignity and life? The answers to these questions may be as buried as the chambers beneath that forgotten church, but the responsibility to keep asking them remains with each generation that inherits the legacy of human history. If this dark chapter of American history has left you questioning what other buried truths lie hidden in our past, subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell. Share this video with someone who isn't afraid to confront the uncomfortable realities of human nature. Let us know in the comments what you think about the relationship between scientific progress and moral responsibility. The shadows of history hold many more secrets that powerful people tried to erase forever. Join us next time as we uncover another buried truth that challenges everything we thought we knew about the foundations of American civilization. Until then, Remember that the most dangerous monsters are often those who convince us they're working for our salvation. The silence of that abandoned valley continues to this day, a reminder that some truths are too terrible for comfort, but too important for forgetting.